The courtroom was cold, sterile, filled with the hushed murmurs of spectators who had already made up their minds. A woman sat at the defendant's table, her posture straight, her expression unreadable, but inside, the fire burned. Across from her, the man who had put her in this chair stood with his hands clasped behind his back, a smirk twitching at the corners of his lips. A police badge gleamed on his chest, but the righteousness it was meant to symbolize was nowhere to be found. He had done this before. Countless times. And today, he was certain, would be no different. "You people," he sneered, his voice dripping with the kind of arrogance only a man convinced of his own untouchability could have. "Always trying to play the victim. Always claiming injustice when you're the ones breaking the law." His gaze swept over the jury, searching for any flicker of doubt. None. They were right where he needed them. Manipulated. Conditioned. Ready to believe whatever filth he was about to spew next. The woman, still composed, tilted her head ever so slightly, her dark eyes locked on him like a blade pressed against skin. But she said nothing. Not yet. The judge cleared his throat. "Officer, please present the evidence." And there it was. Neatly packaged, deliberately fabricated. Surveillance footage that had been edited to erase the truth. A witness statement from a person who didn't exist. A bag of drugs that had never been in her possession. It was a perfect setup. An ironclad case. He stepped closer to the jury, lowering his voice as if he were revealing a great burden. "Ladies and gentlemen, what we have here is another example of crime infecting our streets. She was caught red-handed. We cannot allow this kind of behavior to continue. We must set an example. An example." That was all she was to him. A pawn in his twisted game. He wanted to see her in a cell, not because she had done anything wrong, but because the very sight of her, confident, successful, existing in a space he didn't believe she belonged, made his skin crawl. And so, he had done what men like him had done for centuries. He had wielded his power like a weapon and aimed it straight at her. The jury shifted in their seats, drinking in every word. The gavel was ready to fall. And then, she spoke. "I'd like to ask one question, officer," she said, her voice calm, measured. The smirk widened. "Oh, so now you have something to say?" Her fingers drummed lightly against the table. A rhythm. A pulse. A countdown. "Tell me," she continued, "are you absolutely certain you know who I am?" Silence. A flicker of something in his eyes. Because in that moment, in that single instant where arrogance gave way to uncertainty, he realized something was off. Something he hadn't accounted for. The way she sat there, unshaken, unfazed, despite everything stacked against her. The way she held herself, not like a woman on the brink of conviction, but like a predator waiting for her prey to make one fatal misstep. She smiled. Just slightly. Just enough for the hairs on his neck to rise. And then, the doors of the courtroom swung open. The energy shifted. The air tightened. Men in dark suits entered, their presence swallowing the space, their expressions unreadable but their purpose crystal clear. They moved with the kind of authority that didn't require words. And for the first time since this trial began, the officer's confidence cracked. The woman leaned forward, her voice barely above a whisper, but somehow it filled the entire room. "You really should have done your homework." It was too late. The walls were already closing in around him. His perfectly crafted lie was about to shatter. And as the truth unraveled, as the weight of what he had done finally dawned on him, only one question remained: what happens when the hunter becomes the hunted? Before we dive into today's story, we want to take a moment to say this loud and clear: Plow of Twist stands firmly against racism in all its forms. No one should ever be judged, mistreated, or falsely accused because of the color of their skin. To our black audience, we see you, we stand with you, and your voice matters. This story is a reminder that truth and justice always come to light, no matter how deep people try to bury them. Now, sit back and get ready for an unforgettable story. And if you haven't yet, subscribe to Plow of Twist so you never miss a powerful twist like this one. Enjoy the story. The city of Atlanta pulsed with life even in the late hours of the night. Skyscrapers stood tall against the darkness, their glass windows reflecting the glow of streetlights and neon signs that flickered in and out, illuminating the roads below in an artificial haze. The heartbeat of the city never stopped, a rhythmic hum of traffic, distant sirens, and the murmurs of people trying to carve out their own place in a world that often tried to push them down. This was a city of contradictions, wealth and poverty, progress and prejudice, power and oppression. Some people walked its streets with confidence, moving through life untouched by the shadows that lurked around every corner. Others had to watch every step, knowing that at any moment, a single misstep, real or fabricated, could send their entire world crashing down. For some, justice was a privilege. For others, it was nothing more than an illusion, a promise that was never meant for them. Simone Carter had learned that lesson long ago. She had grown up knowing that no matter how intelligent, how accomplished, how disciplined she was, the world would always find a way to question her. She had been raised by parents who carried the weight of history on their shoulders, her father, a man who had marched for civil rights, who had been arrested for daring to demand equality, who had seen firsthand what it meant to fight against a system that had been designed to break him. Her mother, a woman who had worked herself to the bone, twice as hard, twice as long, to be seen as half as competent as people who had never had to prove themselves at all. They had taught Simone that nothing would be handed to her, that the world would always expect her to fail, and that she would have to be stronger, sharper, and smarter than anyone who dared to stand in her way. And so she had been. She had graduated at the top of her class, earning degrees in law and international relations from Georgetown, proving with every step that she was more than capable of outmaneuvering anyone who underestimated her. She had mastered 3 languages, sharpened her skills in negotiation, counterintelligence, and psychological warfare. She had spent years climbing the ranks of the CIA, dismantling corruption, exposing deception, and ensuring that no one, no matter how powerful, was untouchable. But even with all of that, even with her name etched into classified documents and her fingerprints on some of the most sensitive cases in national security, she knew that the wrong encounter with the wrong man in the wrong place could strip all of that away in an instant. That was the reality she lived with, the reality she had trained herself to expect. And so, when the red and blue lights flashed behind her on an otherwise empty road, she did not panic. She did not sigh in frustration or curse her luck. She simply took a slow, measured breath, keeping her hands firmly on the steering wheel, her fingers gripping the leather just enough to remind herself that she was in control. She had seen this scenario play out too many times, had read the stories, had watched the footage of encounters that had ended in tragedy. But she was not going to be a tragedy. Not tonight. The officer stepped out of his cruiser with a deliberate slowness, his boots heavy against the pavement. She could see him in her side mirror, his frame broad, his shoulders squared with the kind of arrogance that came from years of unchecked power. Officer Travis Miller. She recognized the type immediately. He wasn't just any cop, he was the kind who believed that a badge was a weapon, that authority was a game, that certain people didn't belong in certain places. He was the kind of man who enjoyed moments like this, who saw them as opportunities rather than obligations. He approached the window with the lazy confidence of someone who had already decided how this encounter was going to end. "License and registration," he said, his voice casual but firm, as if he were already bored by the interaction, as if he had already written the ending in his head. Simone didn't argue. She didn't hesitate. She moved carefully, every motion precise and deliberate, retrieving the documents and handing them over without breaking eye contact. She knew how this worked. She knew what he was looking for. A twitch, a nervous glance, any sign of discomfort that he could twist into something sinister. But she gave him nothing. His eyes flickered over her license, his smirk deepening. You live around here? He asked, tilting his head just slightly, as if he were challenging her to lie. She met his gaze with the same unwavering composure she had perfected over years of interrogation training. Is there a problem, officer? His smirk widened, his fingers tapping against the roof of her car. You tell me, he mused, before taking a step back, nodding toward the second officer who had approached from the other side of the vehicle. A younger man, less confident, less sure of himself. He hovered near the edge of the situation, hands resting near his belt, not quite ready to act but prepared if things went south. Step out of the vehicle, Travis ordered, his voice a fraction sharper now, a sliver of amusement curling at the edges. Simone's jaw tightened, but she kept her expression neutral. What's the charge? She asked, though she already knew what was coming. His hand reached into his pocket, and when it emerged, he was holding a small, clear plastic bag. A white substance rested inside. He turned it over in his fingers like it was a precious artifact, his smirk widening into a full grin. Suspicion of possession, he said, his voice almost playful. You fit the description of someone we've been looking for. The lie was so smooth, so effortless, that it might have been convincing if Simone hadn't seen this exact scenario play out too many times before. She could hear the script in his voice, the well-rehearsed cadence of a man who had done this before and had never been questioned. He was enjoying himself. He wanted her to react, to get angry, to give him a reason to escalate. But she wouldn't. Not yet. The younger officer shifted uncomfortably. He wasn't sure about this. He hadn't expected this. But Travis? He thrived on this. He had already decided how this night was going to end. Got a suspect here, he said into his radio, the amusement still lingering in his tone. Gonna need transport. The handcuffs were cold against her skin. The ride to the station was quiet, tense, thick with unspoken truths. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as they led her through the processing area, past rows of desks and officers who barely glanced up. Travis leaned against the desk, arms crossed, his smirk never faltering. Funny, isn't it? He mused, shaking his head as if he found the entire situation amusing. All that attitude, all that confidence, and now look where you are. She didn't respond. She let him talk. You know what your problem is, he continued, his voice dropping into something softer, something meant to be cutting. You walk around acting like you're better than everyone else. But at the end of the day, you're just another criminal. The door opened. A man in a suit stepped inside, moving with the kind of quiet authority that sent a ripple through the room. He whispered something to another officer, and suddenly, there was a shift. A tension that hadn't been there before. Simone smiled. Because she knew. The game was about to change. The room was heavy with the scent of stale coffee, the kind that had been sitting too long on the burner, turning bitter, the kind that filled the air in police stations at all hours of the night. Fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting an artificial glare over the dull, gray walls. The sound of fingers tapping against keyboards mixed with the occasional low murmur of officers exchanging casual conversation, their voices indifferent, detached, as if the woman sitting in handcuffs a few feet away was just another name, another case file, another disposable life passing through the system. But Simone Carter was not disposable. She was not just another woman swept into a corrupt machine that thrived on power imbalances and manufactured guilt. And she knew something none of them did, this night, this situation, this carefully constructed lie that Officer Travis Miller had crafted so smugly, was about to unravel in ways he could never have imagined. Travis stood a few feet away, arms crossed, leaning against the edge of a desk with an air of smug satisfaction. He wasn't even pretending to hide his amusement. He had played this game before. He knew how it worked. There was a script, an order to things, and he controlled every step. Simone was supposed to plead, to beg, to offer explanations that didn't matter because, in the end, he held the power. And power, in the hands of men like him, was a weapon. His voice was thick with condescension when he finally spoke, breaking the silence as he pushed himself off the desk and took a few slow steps toward her. "You know, I gotta say, I expected a little more fight out of you," he mused, tilting his head, studying her like a cat playing with its prey. "Most of you people at least try to argue, try to act like you're above all this. But you've been real quiet." His smirk deepened, his eyes flickering with something almost like disappointment. "What's the matter?" Reality finally sinking in. "It's funny how quick the confidence disappears when those cuffs click, isn't it?" Simone didn't move, didn't even blink. She had faced men far more dangerous than him. She had been in rooms where a single miscalculation meant death, where silence was the difference between walking out alive or disappearing forever. Travis Miller was nothing more than a small man with a badge and a god complex, a predator who had never met a victim he couldn't break. But he had made a fatal mistake. He had assumed she was prey. He continued, his voice dropping into something almost conversational, as if he enjoyed hearing himself speak. "See, the way I see it, you should be thanking me. You're lucky I caught you. This could have ended real different if someone else had. Who knows what could have happened to a woman like you out on these streets, all alone, in the middle of the night. It's dangerous out there." His smile was slow, deliberate, his meaning clear. "Better to be in here with me, don't you think?" Simone finally tilted her head, just slightly, just enough for the smallest ghost of a smile to touch her lips, something so faint it was almost imperceptible. But Travis saw it. And for the first time, something in his expression flickered, a crack in the surface of his absolute certainty. A door opened across the room. The shift was subtle, but it changed the air, sent a ripple through the otherwise static energy of the space. A man entered, his suit crisp, his posture sharp, his presence a silent command. He wasn't in uniform, but the authority in his walk, in the way his eyes scanned the room with absolute precision, left no doubt, he was here for a reason. Simone didn't turn to look at him. She didn't need to. She already knew. The young officer, the one who had lingered uncertainly during the arrest, stiffened at the sight of the man. He leaned toward the officer nearest to him, whispering something, his gaze darting nervously to Travis. Travis, for his part, seemed unfazed. He let out a short chuckle, shaking his head as if he were already bored with whatever interruption was about to take place. "You guys are really dragging this out," he muttered, rubbing a hand over his jaw. "We already got everything we need. Open and shut. What's the holdup?" The man in the suit took another step forward, finally stopping a few feet from where Simone sat. His eyes met hers briefly, just long enough to send a message. And then he turned to Travis. "Officer Miller," he said, his voice calm, measured. "I need to speak with you." Travis raised an eyebrow, glancing around as if to confirm that he was, indeed, being singled out. He let out another short laugh, crossing his arms. "Yeah. And you are?" The man pulled out a badge, flipping it open with the kind of efficiency that suggested he had done it 1,000 times before. But it wasn't a police badge. It was something else. Something bigger. The kind of badge that didn't require explanation. Silence rippled through the room. The younger officer took a step back, his face paling. Travis's smirk faltered, just for a second, just long enough for Simone to see the gears shifting in his mind, the slow realization that something was very, very wrong. But arrogance was a powerful thing, and men like him rarely accepted the idea that the ground beneath them was anything but solid. He scoffed, shaking his head. "Okay," he said, drawing out the word like he was indulging a joke he didn't quite get. "And what exactly does the CIA want with me?" The man in the suit didn't answer immediately. Instead, he reached into his pocket, pulled out a small black device, and set it down on the desk. He pressed a button. A voice filled the room. Travis's voice. "You people always trying to play the victim. Always claiming injustice when you're the ones breaking the law." Silence. Then another snippet. Funny how quick the confidence disappears when those cuffs click, isn't it? A pause. Better to be in here with me, don't you think? The room had frozen. Officers who had been half paying attention were now still, eyes darting between Travis and the man in the suit, the weight of what was happening settling into their bones. Travis's smirk was gone now. His jaw had tightened, his fingers curling into fists at his sides. "Where the hell did you get that?" he snapped, his voice lower now, his confidence cracking like fragile glass. The man in the suit didn't answer. Instead, he turned his gaze to Simone. And then, slowly, deliberately, he spoke. "We have a problem." Simone finally met Travis's eyes, and for the first time since this had all begun, she let him see it, the truth he had been too blind, too arrogant to recognize. The game was no longer in his hands. And the real fight hadn't even started yet. The weight of the moment settled into the walls of the precinct like an invisible force, thick and suffocating, pressing against every person in the room. The man in the suit stood still, his face impassive, his presence a quiet declaration that the tides had shifted. The only sound was the faint hum of electronics, the occasional shuffle of a nervous officer shifting on their feet. No one wanted to be the first to speak. No one wanted to acknowledge what was unfolding before them. But Travis Miller had never been the type to stay silent. His jaw was tight, his breath uneven, a storm brewing just beneath the surface of his forced composure. His eyes flickered to the small black recording device on the desk, its presence now a razor blade against his throat. He had played this game for years, perfected it, made a career out of manipulating the system to his favor. But now, standing in the same room where he had orchestrated the downfall of countless innocent lives, the realization clawed at him: the script had changed. And he was no longer the one holding the pen. His voice was rough when he finally spoke, each word forced out like splinters against his throat. "That," he started, swallowing down the sudden dryness in his mouth, "that doesn't mean anything." He let out a hollow laugh, shaking his head, clinging to arrogance like a life raft in stormy waters. "You think a couple of audio clips are enough to..." The man in the suit didn't flinch, didn't react, didn't so much as blink. His calm was unnerving, a stark contrast to the unraveling happening in front of him. When he finally spoke, his words were razor-sharp, precise. "Officer Miller, you should choose your next words carefully." Travis scoffed, but the edge in his voice betrayed him. "Or what?" His arms crossed over his chest, his stance widening, his body shifting into the aggressive posture of a man trying to reclaim power. "You think I don't know how this works? You think I don't see what you're trying to do? You walk in here, act like you're the big shot, throw around a couple of recordings like they're some kind of smoking gun." His voice was rising now, his control slipping, his frustration bubbling over into a barely contained rage. "You don't have anything." The man in the suit let the words settle, let them hang in the air for just a moment too long. And then, slowly, deliberately, he reached into the inside pocket of his blazer and pulled out a thick, sealed envelope. He placed it on the desk between them with a quiet finality that sent a ripple of unease through the room. "Are you sure about that?" Something in Travis's posture stiffened. His fingers twitched, just slightly, betraying the undercurrent of panic creeping into his veins. His eyes darted to the envelope, then back to the man in the suit. "What the hell is that?" The man didn't answer immediately. Instead, he took his time, his movements slow and calculated as he flipped open the flap and pulled out a stack of documents, thick with print, stapled together in a way that suggested they were not just thrown together in haste, but carefully, methodically assembled over time. "This," the man said, placing the stack down with a quiet thud, "is everything." The room shifted. The younger officer who had been standing nearby took an instinctive step back, as if the very presence of those documents carried weight, as if their existence alone threatened to set off a chain reaction that no one in this precinct was prepared to handle. A few others exchanged glances, silent questions passing between them, an unspoken understanding that whatever was about to unfold would not end quietly. Travis's fingers curled into fists. This is bullshit. But his voice was thinner now, stretched taut with something that sounded dangerously close to doubt. The man in the suit remained unreadable, his gaze steady, unwavering. Your record, Officer Miller. A full breakdown of every arrest, every false report, every manipulated piece of evidence dating back the last 10 years. We have testimonies from officers, from victims, from witnesses who were too afraid to come forward, until now. He slid another document forward, tapping the page with a single finger. We have bank records, showing payments made to informants you fabricated to justify arrests. Surveillance footage contradicting reports you submitted under oath. A detailed timeline of your involvement in at least 17 cases where individuals of color were wrongfully accused, evidence planted, testimonies coerced. He paused, allowing the weight of the words to settle before delivering the final blow. And it doesn't stop there. The silence was deafening. Travis's breathing had changed, more shallow, more uneven. His face was pale now, beads of sweat forming at his temple. He had been caught off guard before, had faced complaints, internal reviews, minor inconveniences that never led to anything real. But this was different. This wasn't a slap on the wrist. This wasn't something that would be buried under a mountain of bureaucracy. This was an execution, carried out with the precision of a scalpel, carving away every layer of protection he had built around himself. His voice cracked when he spoke again. You think you can just walk in here and, the man in the suit cut him off, his voice still infuriatingly calm. I don't think anything, Officer Miller. I know. And then, for the first time since he had entered the room, he turned to Simone. Travis followed his gaze, and something inside him twisted into a tight, suffocating knot. Because Simone Carter was still seated in that chair, still in the very same position she had been in when this all started. But now, there was something in her eyes, something he had been too blind, too arrogant to see before. She had never been afraid. She had never been uncertain. Because she had never been the one on trial. A slow smile curled at the corners of her lips, not one of amusement, not even one of satisfaction, but one of certainty. The kind of smile a person gives when they know the inevitable has finally arrived. The man in the suit stepped aside. Ms. Carter, he said, his voice taking on an edge of finality. Would you like to do the honors? Simone stood. Her movements were unhurried, deliberate, the click of her heels against the tiled floor the only sound breaking the silence. She took her time, stretching out the moment, letting the tension rise, letting the truth seep into every crack of the walls that had once been so solid, so impenetrable. And then, in a voice as smooth as steel, she spoke. I would. Travis's world collapsed. Simone Carter straightened her posture, rolling her shoulders back with the precision of someone who knew exactly how much control she wielded in this moment. The shift was subtle but absolute, the kind of dominance that didn't need to be announced, only felt. The room was suffocatingly silent now, all eyes locked on her, but she only had eyes for one person. Travis Miller. His face was drained of its smugness, his jaw clenched so tightly it looked as if it might crack. His breathing had turned shallow, rapid, the telltale signs of a man who had spent his whole life convinced he was untouchable and was now realizing, in real time, just how wrong he had been. She took a step forward, measured and slow, savoring the moment, not out of cruelty, but out of necessity. This wasn't just about her. It wasn't just about the false charges, the planted evidence, the way he had tried to strip her of her dignity. This was about every person who had sat in that same chair, hands bound, forced to swallow their rage while a man like Travis decided their fate with the flick of a pen. This was about every name that had become a statistic, every life derailed, every person who had never been given the chance to fight back. She let the silence stretch, let it settle into the cracks of his composure like water seeping into a foundation before the freeze that would shatter it. Then, finally, she spoke, her voice smooth but edged with steel. You really should have done your homework. Travis scoffed, the sound sharp, brittle. His hands twitched at his sides, fists clenching and unclenching like he was trying to grasp something that wasn't there. "This is bullshit," he snapped, shaking his head, his voice a shade too high, too desperate. "You can't," Simone tilted her head, cutting him off with nothing more than a look. "I can," she said simply, each word deliberate, unshakable. "And I already have." The man in the suit, who had, until now, remained quiet, slid another document across the desk. "Officer Miller, as of this moment, you are being placed under federal investigation for multiple counts of misconduct, falsification of evidence, and abuse of power under the color of law." His voice was calm, emotionless, but the weight of the words was enough to send a visible shudder through Travis's body. "You are to relinquish your badge and firearm immediately." Travis let out a short, incredulous laugh, but it was empty, hollow. "You're out of your damn mind if you think I'm—" Simone took another step forward, closing the distance between them. "No, Travis," she interrupted, her tone sharper now, cutting through the room like a blade. "You're out of time." He turned to the other officers in the room, searching for something: support, backup, an escape. But the silence that met him was damning. Some wouldn't meet his eyes at all, others shifted uncomfortably, suddenly aware of how exposed they were standing next to him. His chest rose and fell rapidly, his pulse visibly pounding at his temple. This isn't happening," he muttered, his voice losing its conviction with every word. "This is a setup." Simone smiled. Not the polite kind. Not the amused kind. The kind that carried the weight of inevitability. "A setup?" she repeated, raising an eyebrow. "You mean the way you've spent your career planting drugs, fabricating charges, ruining lives? The way you looked me in the eye while framing me for a crime that never happened? You think this is a setup, Travis?" She let the question hang in the air for a beat, then leaned in just slightly, lowering her voice. "No. This is justice." Something inside him cracked then, the reality of the moment crashing down around him. His confidence had carried him for years, protected him, insulated him from consequences. But now, stripped of his shield, he was just a man drowning in his own corruption. His fingers twitched toward his belt, toward his gun, pure muscle memory, a desperate reach for control. The man in the suit was faster. Before Travis could blink, he was staring down the barrel of a weapon that wasn't his own, the safety already disengaged, the cold finality of the moment setting in. "Don't," the agent said, his voice quiet, firm. Travis's hands rose instinctively, his breath shallow, his mind racing. He had never been on this side of the gun before. Simone watched him carefully, studying the shift in his expression, the way fear had begun to creep into the cracks of his carefully constructed arrogance. She took another step forward, speaking softly now, deliberately. "You thought you could play God, didn't you?" Her voice was low, almost hypnotic, forcing him to listen, forcing him to feel every word. "You thought you could decide who mattered, who got to walk free, who had to suffer. You thought you were untouchable." His throat bobbed as he swallowed hard, his eyes darting toward the exits, toward his fellow officers, but no one was coming to his defense. Simone leaned in, her voice barely above a whisper. "You were wrong." And with those 3 words, the last thread of his resistance snapped. A second later, the cold bite of metal clamped around his wrists. The officer who had once relished the sound of cuffs clicking shut on others now flinched at the sensation of them locking around his own skin. The irony was thick, suffocating, and as he was turned around, his badge ripped from his chest, his rights read back to him, the very same script he had recited countless times, his breath came in ragged gasps, his mind scrambling for a way out that didn't exist. Simone stepped back, watching as he was led away, the weight of years of corruption and unchecked power dragging behind him like chains. For the first time since the night had begun, the air in the precinct felt lighter. But she wasn't done yet. As Travis was pulled toward the doors, she turned to the officers still standing in the room, her eyes sweeping over them, her expression unreadable. Some looked guilty. Some looked relieved. Some looked terrified. She took her time before speaking, making sure each and every one of them felt the weight of what had just happened. "This doesn't stop with him," she said finally, her voice steady, unwavering. "I suggest you all think very carefully about where you stand. Because the days of men like Travis Miller running unchecked." She let the words linger, let them sink into their bones, then delivered the final blow. "They're over." And with that, she turned, walking out of the precinct without another word, her heels clicking against the floor, her steps slow and deliberate, the sound echoing in the now silent room like the closing of a chapter that had been long overdue. Justice had been served. But she wasn't finished yet. The precinct doors swung open, and Simone Carter stepped into the cool night air, her pulse steady, her mind sharp. The weight of the evening pressed against her skin, not as a burden, but as a lingering force, a storm that had raged through this place, leaving behind a silence that was more telling than any outburst. Travis Miller was gone, led away in handcuffs, stripped of the power he had wielded so recklessly for so long. But the fight wasn't over. Not yet. She could still feel the eyes on her, the quiet unease of officers who had spent their careers standing beside a man they now realized had been a time bomb waiting to explode. Some of them had turned away when he crossed the line, choosing willful ignorance over confrontation. Others had helped him, enabling his corruption because it was easier to go along with the tide than to stand against it. Now, they were left in the wreckage of their own silence, the cracks in their foundation exposed for all to see. A car pulled up, black and sleek, the kind that didn't blend into traffic, the kind that made people take notice. The driver stepped out without hesitation, his movements quick, efficient, another agent from her world, one that operated in shadows most would never see. He opened the back door for her without a word, but before she slid inside, Simone paused, her gaze lingering on the glass of the precinct windows, where reflections of officers still inside flickered under fluorescent lights. This wasn't the end. Inside the car, the energy shifted, the insulated quiet of the vehicle muting the city's noise. The man in the suit from earlier sat across from her, legs crossed, his expression unreadable. He had been there through it all, orchestrating the fall of Travis Miller with the same careful precision that had been used to build his career in the first place. Now, as they sat in the stillness, he studied her, waiting for her to speak. She exhaled, running a hand over her temple, the adrenaline of the night beginning to settle into something heavier. "It's not enough," she said finally, her voice even, but carrying the weight of something unresolved. The man nodded slightly, as if he had expected those words. "No," he agreed. "It's not." Simone turned her gaze to the window, watching the city blur past, its light streaking against the glass like ghosts of stories untold. "There are more like him," she said, not as a question, but as a statement of fact. "And some of them are still in that precinct." He didn't argue. He didn't have to. They both knew the truth. Travis Miller wasn't an anomaly, he was a symptom of a disease that had been festering for decades, a product of a system that had allowed men like him to thrive. Taking him down was necessary, but it wasn't a cure. The man tapped a finger against the armrest, a silent beat of consideration before he spoke. "Miller's arrest is going to send shockwaves," he said, his voice measured. "Some will distance themselves. Others will try to cover their tracks. There's going to be a divide." He turned his gaze to her, his eyes sharp. "And then there will be the ones who want revenge." Simone's jaw tightened, but her expression remained unreadable. She knew that, too. She had seen it before. When power was challenged, when corruption was exposed, there were always those who refused to go down quietly. Travis Miller had plenty of friends, men who had benefited from the world he had built, men who saw his downfall not as justice, but as an attack on everything they stood for. Her fingers drummed lightly against her knee, the rhythm a subconscious calculation. "Let them try," she murmured. The man across from her didn't react immediately, just observed, as if assessing the layers beneath her words. Then, after a beat, he leaned forward slightly, his voice lower, more pointed. "You need to be careful," he said, his tone carrying the weight of something personal. "Tonight was a victory, but it also put a target on your back." Simone met his gaze without hesitation. "There's always been a target on my back," she said simply. He studied her for another moment, then nodded once, acknowledging the truth in that. He reached into his pocket, pulling out another folder, this one thinner, but no less important. "The Department of Justice is going to open an investigation," he said, sliding it toward her. "But it's going to be slow. There are too many hands in too many places. And there are people who don't want this to go any further than Miller." She already knew that. Exposing one officer was one thing. Exposing a system? That was a war. Her fingers traced the edge of the folder, but she didn't open it. "And the others?" she asked. The man exhaled, tilting his head slightly. "Some will run," he admitted. "Some will dig in. And some will make sure you never step foot in that precinct again." Simone let a small, humorless smile touch her lips. "They can try," she repeated. The car slowed, turning down a quieter street, away from the noise of the city. The building they pulled up to was secure, discreet, the kind of place where plans were made, where decisions that never made the news were finalized behind closed doors. Before stepping out, Simone turned back to the man in the suit. "What's your next move?" she asked. He considered her for a moment, then smiled slightly. "That depends," he said. "What's yours?" She let the question hang between them for a moment, the weight of the night pressing against her skin, the consequences of what had been set into motion unfolding in her mind. Then, without another word, she stepped out of the car, walking into the darkness with the certainty of someone who had already decided. The war wasn't over. It was just beginning. The air inside the conference room was heavy, thick with tension that settled deep into the walls, pressing against the people seated around the long, steel table. There was no movement, no sound beyond the faint, steady hum of the ventilation system, and yet the weight of unspoken words filled the space like a storm on the horizon. The atmosphere wasn't just tense, it was volatile, the kind of quiet that came before something irreversible happened. Simone Carter sat among them, her posture poised, her expression unreadable, but beneath the surface, her mind was a razor, slicing through the uncertainty, calculating the paths ahead. She had known this moment would come, had prepared for it, had expected the backlash. But knowing and experiencing were two different things, and now, as she sat with these people, some allies, some not, all of them bound by the fallout of what had just been set into motion, she felt the shift in the air, the turning of the tide. The man in the suit, the one who had been her quiet ally in all of this, was sitting across from her, his fingers steepled beneath his chin, his gaze sharp, focused, dissecting the room just as she was. He was calm, too calm, the kind of stillness that wasn't passive, but controlled, intentional. It was a skill she recognized, had mastered herself. He wasn't the type to react emotionally, wasn't the type to be rattled, and that meant whatever he was about to say was going to carry weight. When he finally spoke, his voice was even, measured, but each word carried the gravity of the moment. "Miller is in federal custody," he said, the statement landing like a cold fact, no embellishment, no room for doubt. "And he's already trying to cut a deal." The shift in the room was instant, a ripple of unease threading through the people seated around the table. Some tensed, shoulders going stiff, others exchanged quick, uneasy glances, the kind that spoke of calculations happening in real time. Simone didn't move, didn't so much as blink. She had expected this. Men like Miller didn't go down without a fight, and when cornered, they did what all cowards did, they turned on each other. He had spent years building his kingdom, but the moment it started to crumble, he had no intention of going down with it. His self-preservation was predictable, almost disappointing in its lack of originality. She leaned back slightly, folding her arms across her chest, her voice steady. "And what exactly does he think he has to bargain with?" The man in the suit exhaled, tapping a finger against the table, a slow, deliberate movement. "Names. Connections. He's claiming he wasn't acting alone. There was another ripple of unease, this one stronger, cutting deeper. Simone didn't need to turn her head to know what the others were thinking. Some of them had assumed, wrongly, that Miller was an isolated case, that his downfall would be contained, that they could remove one tumor without realizing the entire system was diseased. But Simone had never believed that. She had known from the beginning that Miller wasn't just one bad cop, he was a symptom of something larger, something rooted deep, something that wouldn't die just because one man had been taken out of play. She tilted her head slightly, her voice neutral, but with an edge. And is he lying? The silence that followed was deafening. The man in the suit met her gaze, his expression unreadable, but his answer was clear. No. Simone's fingers tightened slightly where they rested against her arm, but outwardly, she remained composed. The confirmation wasn't a surprise, but it still sent a slow burn through her chest, a frustration that she had long since learned to bury under layers of control. Miller had been a problem, but he had never been the only one. Now, the real question wasn't whether he was telling the truth, it was how deep the rot went. A new voice cut through the tension, sharp, laced with frustration. If he talks, we're going to have a problem. Simone turned her head slightly, her dark eyes locking onto Agent Daniels, a woman who had, up until now, kept her opinions largely to herself. But now, her posture was tight, her expression strained, and there was something in her voice, something close to fear, though she masked it well. Simone didn't flinch. We already have a problem. Daniels let out a short, bitter laugh, shaking her head as she leaned forward. You don't get it, Carter. You put a target on all of us. Taking down Miller was one thing, but if he starts naming names, if this goes beyond him, she gestured vaguely, her jaw clenching. This isn't just about one bad cop anymore. It's about the entire infrastructure that's been protecting him. Simone's gaze didn't waver. Good. Daniels exhaled sharply, shaking her head again, her frustration bleeding into her voice. Good. You think it's good that we've just declared war on half the law enforcement agencies in this state? You think it's good that there are people, right now, in rooms just like this one, trying to figure out how to shut this down before it spreads any further? There are men who have spent their entire careers making sure people like Miller never face consequences, and you just threw a grenade into their entire operation. Simone's expression remained unreadable. Then let them burn with it. The weight of her words hung heavy in the air, settling into the cracks of the room like a slow-moving fire. Some of the people at the table shifted, uncertain, while others sat still, processing, deciding where they stood. The man in the suit finally spoke again, his voice quieter now, but no less sharp. There are going to be consequences, Carter. There already are. Simone nodded slightly, her voice calm, certain. I'm aware. He studied her for a long moment, then leaned back, rubbing a hand over his jaw. Miller's deal hasn't been accepted yet, he said. But if it is, we're going to have to move fast. He's not the only one we're looking at. He reached for a folder on the table, tapping a single finger against the top page. Simone glanced down, catching a glimpse of the names printed there. Names she recognized. Names she had suspected. Names that had, for too long, operated in the shadows without consequence. Her jaw tightened. Then we don't wait. The room was silent again. They were at a crossroads, all of them, standing at the edge of something that couldn't be undone. Daniels exhaled, rubbing her temples. You know what's going to happen if we push this forward, right? Simone met her gaze without hesitation. Yes. Daniels studied her for a long moment, then finally sighed, shaking her head. Jesus. You're really not afraid of anything, are you? Simone tilted her head slightly, a small, knowing smile touching her lips. I don't have the luxury of fear. The man in the suit pushed the folder toward her, his gaze steady, unwavering. Then let's get to work. Simone picked up the folder, flipping it open, her mind already calculating the next steps. The war had begun, and she had no intention of losing. The air inside the room was thick with tension, the kind that sat heavy in the lungs, making it hard to breathe. The weight of what had been set into motion pressed down on everyone seated at the long steel table, each of them calculating, reconsidering, bracing for what came next. No one spoke immediately. Words carried consequences here, and no one wanted to be the first to break the silence. Simone Carter sat still, her back straight, her hands folded neatly in front of her, but her mind was moving fast, dissecting every angle, every risk, every potential betrayal that could come from what they were about to do. There was no turning back now. This wasn't just about Miller anymore, this was about everyone who had stood beside him, shielded him, allowed him to operate without consequence. The rot ran deep, deeper than any of them had admitted, and now, with the floodgates cracked open, there was no stopping what was coming. The man in the suit, the one who had been her quietest but most consistent ally, exhaled slowly, his fingers drumming lightly against the edge of the folder in front of him. He had always been composed, unshaken, but tonight there was something in his expression that hadn't been there before, a tightness in his jaw, an edge to his gaze. He understood what was at stake, understood better than anyone that this wasn't just a political move or a tactical play. This was war, and wars had casualties. Miller is locked up, he said finally, his voice even, measured, carrying no trace of emotion. For now. That last part hung in the air, heavier than the rest. Simone didn't react, but she knew exactly what he meant. Miller wasn't going to stay locked up forever. He had too much information, too many names, too many people who had a vested interest in making sure he didn't talk. The walls around him weren't built to keep him in, they were built to keep certain people out, people who wanted to make sure he didn't get the chance to say what he knew. He was a liability now, and liabilities in this world didn't last long. Daniels, the agent who had been the most vocal about her concerns, shifted in her seat, crossing her arms tightly over her chest. "They're going to come for him," she said, not as speculation, but as a certainty. "They're not going to let this play out in court. He's worth too much to too many people." Simone finally spoke, her voice calm, even, betraying nothing. "Then we need to move first." Daniels let out a short, bitter laugh, shaking her head. "And do what, Carter? Put him in a box and hope no one finds him? The second he gets a lawyer, the second he opens his mouth in front of the wrong person, it's over. We don't control the system, we just exposed it. And now we have to deal with what that means." The man in the suit didn't speak, just watched, waiting to see how Simone would respond. Simone leaned forward slightly, her gaze locked onto Daniels with the kind of intensity that made it clear she had already considered every argument, every counterpoint. "You're right," she said, her voice smooth, precise. "We don't control the system. But we control what happens next. We control how much damage this does, how far it spreads. And right now, Miller is the weakest link in a very long chain. They can either try to silence him or they can try to spin this into something that benefits them. Either way, we dictate the pace." Daniels shook her head again, frustration evident in the way her fingers curled into fists against the table. "You make it sound so simple." "It is simple," Simone countered, her voice unwavering. "We keep him alive. We keep him talking. And we make sure that every name he gives us is protected by a public record before they have the chance to make it disappear." Daniels exhaled sharply, rubbing a hand over her face. "And what happens when they come after us instead? Because that's next, Carter. You think they're just going to sit back and let us burn this whole thing to the ground? They're going to push back. And when they do, it won't be through the legal system. It won't be through press conferences and statements. It's going to be through threats, through intimidation, through people disappearing in the middle of the night." The man in the suit finally spoke again, his voice quiet but firm. "She's not wrong." Simone met his gaze, holding it steady. "I never said she was." The room was silent again, but this time, it wasn't hesitation, it was calculation. Daniels sighed, leaning back in her chair, her jaw tight. "I hope you know what you're doing." Simone allowed herself the smallest hint of a smile, one that didn't quite reach her eyes. "I always do." The man in the suit reached for the folder again, flipping it open with careful precision. "Then let's make this official." He turned the first page, revealing a list of names, each one neatly typed, each one linked to a case, a department, an accusation. Some of the names Simone recognized immediately. Some she had suspected. Some were new, and those were the ones that mattered most, the ones who had operated in the background, unseen, unnoticed, powerful because they had never been brought into the light. "This is just the beginning," the man in the suit said, his voice almost too quiet, as if he was speaking more to himself than to anyone else. Simone reached for a pen, poised it over the document, then paused, lifting her gaze. "No," she corrected, her voice clear, unwavering. "This is the reckoning." And with that, she signed her name. The weight of everything that had transpired settled into the cracks of the city like a storm that had passed but left destruction in its wake. The fallout had begun, slow at first, a ripple that turned into a wave, washing over everything, exposing truths that had long been buried beneath layers of corruption and silence. The system had fought back, of course, clawing desperately to protect itself, to contain the damage, to rewrite the narrative before it could spread too far. But it was too late. The truth was out now, and once the light had been shined into the darkest corners, there was no putting the shadows back where they belonged. Names had been exposed, files had been leaked, and the once impenetrable wall of protection that men like Travis Miller had hidden behind was crumbling, piece by piece. Miller himself sat in a federal holding cell, stripped of his badge, stripped of the power he had abused for so long. He had tried to negotiate, to manipulate, to twist the situation in his favor, but for the first time in his life, there was no escape route, no falsified reports to save him, no friends in high places willing to extend a hand. He had been useful once, a tool for those above him, but now, he was a liability, and those same people were eager to watch him fall. His trial was set, and the evidence against him was insurmountable. He had built a career out of stealing years from innocent lives, and now, it was his turn to watch time slip through his fingers, powerless to stop it. The irony was poetic, almost cruel in its precision. But there was no sympathy to be found for him, no redemption waiting in the wings. He had made his choices, and now, he would face the consequences. The others who had stood beside him, who had played their own roles in the machinery of corruption, were scrambling. Some had resigned quietly, hoping to avoid public scrutiny. Some had been arrested, caught in the web of their own making. And some, the ones who had the most to lose, had tried to fight back. Threats had been made, whispers had reached Simone's ears, warnings that she had gone too far, that there were still people willing to protect the old ways, that she had put herself in danger by refusing to look the other way. But she had never been one to bow to fear. If they wanted a war, they had already lost. Simone Carter walked through the halls of a different building now, not the precinct where this had all started, but somewhere much higher, much colder. The Department of Justice had taken notice, had seen what she had done, what she had exposed, and they had made a decision. Some people wanted her silenced. Others wanted her contained. But there were those who had watched carefully, who had seen her work, who understood that she was not just another name to be erased. She was an asset. And so, instead of being pushed aside, she had been brought further in, given resources, given access, given a seat at a table that had, for too long, been reserved for those who had never wanted people like her to have power. She had spent her life dismantling corruption from the outside. Now, she would do it from within. Daniels had been right about one thing. There had been a target on her back from the moment this all started. But now, that target had shifted. Now, the ones who had thought they were untouchable were the ones watching their backs, wondering when the knock on their door would come, when the files they had buried would surface, when the lies they had told would come back to destroy them. Simone wasn't just one woman anymore. She was a force, and the people who had stood with her, who had fought beside her, were no longer afraid to push forward. Daniels herself had taken a different path. She had spent too many years trying to play within the rules, trying to believe that the system could be fixed from the inside. But now, she saw it for what it was. She had left her position, walking away from the agency that had tied her hands for too long. But she wasn't done. She had found another way, another battle to fight, and she had made sure that she and Simone would never be too far apart. Because wars like these weren't won overnight. And sometimes, you needed people fighting from both sides. The city moved on, as cities always do. New stories filled the headlines, new scandals, new distractions. But beneath it all, the change had already begun. It wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic, but it was there, threading itself through the fabric of a world that had long resisted it. Some people would never see it. Some would pretend it hadn't happened. But for those who had been watching, for those who had been waiting for someone to finally say enough, it was undeniable. The walls had cracked, and nothing would ever be quite the same again. And Simone Carter? She walked away from it all without looking back, not because she was finished, but because there was more work to be done. The war wasn't over. But now, it was being fought on her terms. Power. It's a funny thing, isn't it? Some people spend their entire lives chasing it, others are born into it, and then there are those who have it ripped away from them the second they try to claim it for themselves. But power isn't just about who holds the badge, who signs the documents, who controls the laws. It's about perception. It's about who people believe has control. And the second that belief shifts, the second people start to realize that the ones who have always ruled over them are not untouchable, everything changes. Travis Miller thought he was untouchable. He thought the system would protect him, that the people he worked for would always shield him from consequences. He thought he could move through the world without ever facing the weight of the lives he had destroyed. And for a long time, he was right. But here's the thing about power, it only lasts as long as people let it. And the second Simone Carter decided she wasn't going to let it anymore, his empire collapsed. So let me ask you, how many Travis Millers do you think are still out there? How many people are still hiding behind the same system, making the same decisions, believing they will never have to answer for the damage they cause? And more importantly, what happens when someone like Simone Carter decides they've had enough? Maybe this story made you angry. Maybe it made you think. Maybe it made you wonder how many times something like this has happened without anyone stopping it. And if it did, if it made you feel even a fraction of the frustration, the injustice, the fire that Simone felt, then maybe you already know the answer to that last question. Because the moment people start asking the right questions, the moment they stop accepting the way things have always been, that's when everything starts to change. And that's when people like Travis Miller realize that their time is up. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more tales of twists, justice, and the unexpected, make sure to subscribe to Tales of Twist so you never miss what happens next. Because trust me, there's always another story waiting to be told. And you won't want to miss it.